Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graven. Our guest today is Stephen L. Blue. He is the CEO of Miller Ingenuity. It's a global manufacturer and supplier of railroad parts and high technology rail safety systems and services. So Steve is a recognized expert in business transformation. He has more than 50 years of experience leading companies across diverse industries like manufacturing and publishing. He has a proven track record of turning businesses around and driving massive profit increases. And Steve is also a best-selling author. He's a media personality, a keynote speaker. He has spoken at venues including Harvard Business School, the United Nations, and Carnegie Hall. His leadership insights have been featured in outlets including the Wall Street Journal, Fox Business Channel, Forbes, and CNBC. So join me in welcoming Steve to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. Playing Carnegie Hall, that's kind of your musician's dream, isn't it? Right, to say someday you
Yeah.
play Carnegie Hall. What was the event?
Well, fortunately, they didn't ask me to sing or play an instrument. It was a forum on global leadership, specifically entrepreneurship. And I guess they picked the venue of Carnegie Hall. And there was maybe, I think, 3 of us on the stage at various times. But, as you can imagine, it is difficult to do anything at Carnegie Hall. I mean, and I've spoken at the United Nations, and I thought their security was tough.
Oh.
Their rules were tough, but Carnegie Hall is much more complicated.
Interesting. Well, famed venue and important discussions. And I think we're going to have an important discussion here today. So there's a lot I want to ask you about your business and your experience. But as we always do here, Steve, I'm going to ask the key question. What would you say is your favorite mistake?
That's a really good question. I wish I could say I only had one favorite mistake.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of them. So we're not going to cover them all because you don't have time to cover them all. But I can tell you the one that sticks in my mind more, and I've made a lot of mistakes. One that sticks in my mind more than anything else, which taught me a really, really good lesson, was when I tried to start a television broadcast out of Havana, Cuba. Oh. And I'd just come off a very successful endeavor in Mexico. So I thought, hey, I got this whole Latin American thing down, and I could do this. It's not a problem. Thought I had all the bases covered, and I completely lost my shirt on that. I don't remember how much money I lost, but it was a lot of money. Yeah. And it was a huge risk. I had to jump through. You wouldn't believe how many hoops. And this was, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
And then as now, you don't just walk into Cuba anytime you want.
Right.
Unless you want to get arrested. And so I had to do it legally, which I did. And there were a lot of technical issues, a lot of language issues, customs issues, local issues, and so forth. And I thought I had them all down. I did. I had them all down. Mm-hmm. Great. All that stuff down. Then I couldn't sell the damn thing. Nobody wanted to buy it. So that's where I lost all my money.
And so when you say a TV broadcast, was this going to be a channel? I imagine the media landscape in Cuba must be very government controlled.
Yeah, it would have been an internet television broadcast.
Okay.
25 years ago, that was a lot more complicated and a lot less accepted and a lot less used than it is today. But so I taped everything, and I brought all the tapes back. These are like big VCR tapes. It's like not like you could do it today. And then I did that all legally. I didn't want to mess with the Cuban government or the American government either, because they take a whole view of that. But the problem was I totally misjudged the interest in the United States for an event that was happening in Cuba. It was in my industry, in the railroad industry, and I thought, okay, people will be willing to spend, since they can't go for this event, they should be willing to spend $1,000 to watch it and see it and participate in it, but nobody bought it.
Oh, okay. So I was picturing sort of the wrong concept of nowadays this would be a live streamed event, we might call it. So you weren't talking, this was for an event, not a general network of programming. Okay.
Yeah, it was
Gotcha.
the coverage of an event that should have been interesting to people in the United States and in Europe, but it wasn't.
Yeah. And I mean, was the interest low at any price, do you think? Or I mean, did you have to charge an amount that just wasn't in line with what
That's a good
people would
question.
pay?
I don't remember what I was charging. It was something like $1,000. And the expenses were my travel down there, hiring a television crew from Mexico
Mm-hmm.
and bringing them down to Cuba and so forth. So my costs weren't that high, but they were, I don't know, probably 10, 15,000, something like that. And so I figured I need at least, 15 people. That's all I need is 15 people to
Mm-hmm.
buy this thing and I break even. So it's a mistake I made, and a mistake a lot of people make is, okay, all I got to do is sell this and do this and I break even, I'm okay. Well,
Yeah.
that break even number is probably going to be a little more complicated and difficult to achieve than you think.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm trying to think how would you accurately forecast the interest in something new? I mean, this was
Yeah,
entrepreneurial, it was innovative, hadn't been done in your space. You know,
right.
how could you know other? I mean, I guess you could try to survey people, or it seemed like it would be a tough thing to accurately forecast.
Well, obviously it was. And
Yeah.
I had been in that industry, the same one I'm in now, for quite a few years before that. And I had started a trade show in Mexico for people in that industry.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of a joint thing with American suppliers and Mexican railroads and so forth. So I sort of understood the landscape of what people in the United States were interested in,
Yeah.
but I misforecasted that. You're right. It's just something new. It's never been done before. There's an inherent risk in it. But
Yeah.
that's not why it was a mistake.
Yeah.
It was a mistake because of my ego.
Mm.
Because I'd just come off the Mexican thing, which was a huge risky venture. And I made a ton of money on that. It was a fabulous success. And that's when my ego took over and said, oh, yeah, sure, I can do anything now. And Cuba's just, a couple of miles away. The
Mm-hmm.
language is the same, which it's not.
Yeah.
But my assumption was that it was the same. The customs are the same, which they are not. None of that's
Oh.
true.
Yeah.
And it was my ego deciding that I could do that because I had just done something in Mexico. And that's what I tell people all the time. The seed to every failure has been born from a success.
Mm.
Every
Yeah.
time you have a success, that is a seed of your next failure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Why do you say that's okay?
Well,
Or
because
it's yeah.
if you don't fail, it's like you can't win a ball game if you don't throw the first basket, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
you can't hit a home run unless you take a swing, which
Mm-hmm.
inherently has the risk of missing the ball. And
Right.
so the idea is, I don't know anybody. You might, but I don't know anybody that's had 100% success rate.
No. No. I
Elon
don't
Musk
know.
hasn't,
No.
right? Einstein didn't, Ford didn't. And so the
Mm-hmm.
idea is you got to fail
Right.
to learn how to succeed. And
Mm.
if you succeed, you're going to eventually fail
Yeah.
because of a lot of reasons. So you shouldn't be afraid. It's okay to have failed in that. Did that stop me from taking my next risk? No.
No.
But it made me a little more sensitive, a little more aware, and a little more, okay, let's just double check these assumptions, because
Mm-hmm.
and your listeners know that the basis of every decision begins with assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
and if those assumptions are correct, the odds of the decision being correct are pretty good.
Right.
If those assumptions are not correct, the odds of the decision being
Mm-hmm.
wrong is pretty good. And that was my problem in Cuba. My assumptions were all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you learned that in the big, expensive way, as you've described. I mean, I think one thing that's fascinating, in entrepreneurship circles today, people talk about stating your assumptions of don't confuse knowledge or facts or data with assumptions. And it's inevitable you will have to make assumptions. But I think for one, it's stating this is an assumption. And
Mhm.
then there's that question of how is there a way to test that assumption
Right.
on a small scale to possibly disprove it so I don't move forward
Mhm.
and make a big investment or a big mistake.
And that's why
Easier
people
said than
have
done.
boards of directors. And that's why people should have boards of directors,
Yeah.
whether they're informal or they're formal. Is if you have a major investment you want to make, the first thing you start off with, you should start off, that I start out with my board, is here are my assumptions.
Yep.
And here's what I want to do, and here's what I want to do it. And you stop after your assumptions because they should test it on you. You want them to test it on you because it's a different set of ears and eyes.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, if you don't test your assumptions, you're liable to go wrong. Okay, maybe you'll go right. I had assumptions in the Mexico thing, a lot of other things, and they were correct. But because I thought there were so similarities between the two projects or endeavors, if you will, that was a mistake. My assumptions were all wrong, and I didn't know it until it was too late.
Yeah. And I mean, I appreciate you sharing this story, Steve, because like you said, successful people have failures, make mistakes. We demonstrate that. When guests are gracious enough to share their stories, here on My Favorite Mistake. But I mean, I think you kind of sketched out a bit of a formula, kind of recap and get your feedback on. So and you make me think first of the phrase, you hear it in financial commercials: past success is not indicative of, or past performance is not indicative of future returns.
Yep.
But I appreciate you articulating that. But it seems like that formula was, past success plus ego plus assumptions equaled mistake.
Yeah. Yep. It's only your ego that immediately figures your assumptions must be right.
Especially when you've got a past success to say, well, look, I was right here. So,
yeah. And I'll bet you, and I'll bet most, if not all of your listeners, if you ask them, when you have an idea, is it always right? They may not say always, but they'll say, most of the time my ideas are pretty good. Just because they're your ideas don't mean they're any good. Just means they're your ideas.
Yeah.
And where you have to park your ego and park your position of authority, if you have it with your team, is you say, okay, I have no idea if this is a good idea or not. It's an idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's one I had. I want to try out on you guys and see what you think and get different viewpoints of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so important, is being open to the input, inviting people to challenge an idea. Is there something you see that I'm missing? And that challenge could come from employees. What you're describing, it seems like it should come from a board, but some people like putting together a board that never challenges them. Yep. And it seems like that could work for a while until it doesn't, when bad assumptions maybe catch up to somebody. Again, past success plus ego plus assumptions plus not being open to people challenging you. That's part of the formula too, it seems.
It is. And people put the boards together, as you just alluded to, that will agree with them, that won't oust them at the first sign of problems. And that's, of course, and even in public companies, they have a pretty big degree of control over that. But the board is your best friend in terms of challenging your assumptions, because you can't fire them. And they're not, or they shouldn't be afraid of you. But here's the thing: when you're testing out an idea or an assumption, you have to be careful of the inherent risks and problems with people's reaction to anything new. I don't like new ideas. You don't either. Neither do your listeners, unless it's mine. If it's your new idea, I don't like it, right? And so you have to be careful of the natural inclination that humans have of rejecting anything that's new or unfamiliar. And so there's a way to weave around that, make sure that that's not the objection, and then get to the root of the objection by challenging the assumptions they make.
Yeah. Well, you make a point there where, if somebody is challenging or disagreeing with an assumption or part of a plan, I mean, it seems like it's good to lean into that and have some discussion where, like, if you shoot it down, assuming it's just knee-jerk reactivity, knee-jerk negativity, that could be a bad assumption, as opposed to digging into it. And maybe with that discussion, hopefully if there's, respect and a good discussion, somebody says, the board member says, "Oh, Steve, okay, no, Steve, you've convinced me. I
Yeah.
I see it your way now, and it's not just rolling over, or in the other direction. It's like, okay, well, I realize you're not just being cynical or scared or negative. Yeah, that is a valid concern. We need to adjust an assumption.
And that's why a lot of CEOs get informal. You've heard the phrase before, kitchen cabinets.
Yeah.
People who don't really have a stake in the outcome. Boards do, and boards always have inherent imbalances, inherent wishes for the business. Kitchen cabinet, they don't. It's like, I really don't care what the outcome is, but I do care about you. So then you kind of lose the risk of the inherent. I don't like it because it's new. I don't like it because I never met any board, as an example, that would be in favor of, let's kill the product that makes the most money for us because somebody else will if we don't. So we need to introduce you. Well, you know the theme. And so they'll always say no to that. They will always say no to that. And sometimes that's the wrong answer. If you're talking to a kitchen cabinet, they could objectively say, yeah, you have to do that. If you don't believe me, look at Kodak.
I was thinking of them. Absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect prime example. They knew it was coming for years, would say, oh no. And I get that. I get your cash cow has to be preserved. But there are ways to go to the next generation of cash cow and use your cash cow to fund those new developments while you have cash to fund it. By the time Kodak decided they had to do something, but they didn't have any cash.
Yeah.
They could have gone digital long before they did, but they didn't.
The cash cow was dying, and it's a coincidence. I did as a graduate student a 6-month internship at Kodak in the second half of 1998 in the Kodak digital business unit, and they were making high end photojournalist digital cameras that would sell for $10,000 or $15,000. Our iPhones today probably take better pictures than then. But the cash cow was paper and film, and there were senior leaders I heard at Kodak saying, I don't know if they believed it or they wanted Wall Street to believe it, that because of digital photography, people would want to print more pictures. So yes, film sales would go down, but paper sales were going to skyrocket, and that was a bad assumption. Who prints pictures anymore? Right.
Were you in Rochester when you worked for Kodak? Yeah. I spent about 7 or 8 years in Rochester. At the time, was the second biggest company in the city. Kodak, of course, being the biggest one. This was a company called General Railway Signal, and they were an iconic company just like Kodak was. Had been around forever, for 100 years maybe, just like Kodak was, and they eventually went the same way that Kodak did. They didn't want to get contemporary with the future. They didn't want to invest money in new products. They just wanted to sort of let things die out. So fortunately, I parachuted out of there before it was too late for me, but it wasn't too late for them.
Yeah. Well, and there was a lot of ingenuity at Kodak. I want to ask you, Steve, about your company, Miller Ingenuity. The ingenuity at Kodak was patents, invention of very early digital cameras, professional photojournalist cameras, where it was supply constraints, not demand constraints. Early consumer digital cameras that were looked at as toys, and that was part of the challenge. And then even some of the ingenuity that they were rightfully very proud of was the Mars rover at the time. The images being sent back from the Mars rover was Kodak digital imaging technology. So there was a lot of ingenuity that just did not get translated into ongoing business success.
Well, the ingenuitors, if that's a word, it probably isn't, are not the people who make the decision on funding the ingenuity.
Yeah.
The guys who don't know anything about, well, they'll know something, but the guys at the top who are more concerned with, especially if you're a public company, the next quarter's earnings, they're the ones that decide on funding these things, not the people who are down there creating them.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk about the company you're CEO of, Miller Ingenuity. I would love to hear about the company, the origin of the name. Reading a little online, it was founded by someone named Miller.
Yep.
But I'm curious, the Ingenuity name, like to me, that almost sounds like, a digital marketing firm or something
Right.
that's not making railroad parts.
Well, thank you for the observation, because that's exactly our corporate name is Miller Feldpax Corporation. All right.
Yeah.
So the problem with that name, early, we've been around for 75 years. Early in our livelihood, we made products that were like gravel and guts mechanical devices.
Mm-hmm.
Fine. That's what sustained the company for many, many years. And Feldpax, I won't bore you with what that, but it described sort of one of the products that we made with the twist. The X was the lawyer's twist on here's how we can patent or trademark. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so all of those products, those early products, mechanical products, were good products. And we still make many of them today. But when I decided we needed to become more inventive and move into electronics, not shed all the mechanical products,
Mm-hmm.
but move into electronics, I did it a couple of ways. One, I made a couple acquisitions and lower technology electronic products, so my people could begin to learn to understand that kind of slowly. But then we had a problem with the name, because we were known only as the mechanical guys who made these Feldpax things, okay?
Yeah.
And we had to change that name, so we went to great expense and great trouble to come up with something. We couldn't lose the Miller name because my shareholders wouldn't allow that.
Right.
And besides that, if you in the industry today or any day or 20 years ago, you say Miller's products, they know right away it's us.
Mm-hmm.
So there was value and still value in that name. But then we had to find something that would connote inventiveness. And so we paid a marketing communications company to come up with the term ingenuity.
Yeah.
And then we spent a great deal of time and money converting from the old to the new and, rebranding ourselves. And that took a number of years. About the time we were introducing higher technology products, the new trade name had already taken hold.
Yeah.
So you had to put one before the other. You just couldn't. It would be easy to invent new things, but if the market didn't believe you were creatively enough to invent it, you'd never be able to sell it. And that can apply to any company who's trying to change their image, if you will.
Sure. Well, and what year was that name change?
I would say that was probably, what is today is 2024, probably 2015-ish.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Roughly 2014, 2015.
Yeah. And so it sounds like because that's a big decision. It's a decision you don't want to be wrong about. There are times companies have changed their name and there was outcry or uproar, and like I think of consulting firm, I think changed its name to Monday at some point, one of the big consulting firms, and it was just pretty universally mocked and lampooned, and I'm pretty sure they backed off on that. Which, okay, that gets you, as they call it, earned media, but maybe not the
right earned media.
No. But I mean, it sounds like, you were as you're talking through some of that story, there were different steps to take to test assumptions, or at least try to mitigate the risk of a bad decision. Or, I think it's interesting, like in this situation, you make the decision because you think it's a good decision. You've tested assumptions, you've learned from past mistakes, and there's probably somebody saying at the moment, this is a big mistake. Like, they don't know that any more than it's a good idea. But I think, in general, when someone says you're making a mistake, it highlights that they have different assumptions, or they're making a different hypothesis.
Right. A couple of my directors hated the idea.
Uh-huh.
What are you doing with Daddy's name?
Yeah.
Right. I didn't do anything with Daddy's name. If I knew I shouldn't try for a lot of reasons to take Daddy's name out. That'd be stupid.
Yeah.
But I had a couple of directors who were dead set against the idea. They thought that they're not close enough to the market to really understand your objections. Your objections were completely based on it's always been done that way. It's always been filler Feldpax. I mean, we can't change it now. And why should we change it now? So, well-intentioned people, to be sure.
but it's worked out.
It has worked out because, and I advise a lot of CEOs about the same thing. If you're going to do this, it's a multi-year long process.
Mm-hmm.
I think it took us from the beginning of, ideation of what the name would be and why the name would be and all that kind of stuff to the actual pulling of the trigger, which was done in stages. I think it was about a 3-year process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To your point, to make sure you do it right and you understand the implications.
Yeah. So, Stephen, one thing I want to ask about your company, it related to my background and some of the guests who've been on the show here who have a background with lean manufacturing or Lean Six Sigma or some of the other Toyota production system. I did a little poking around. The company website talks about some of your initiatives there. I was wondering if you could kind of describe from your perspective as CEO what that means to Miller Ingenuity and the people who work there.
Yeah. I wrote a piece for I think Industry Week a while back, and the title was "Why Smart Manufacturing is a Dumb Idea," and that got people's attention as you would expect.
Yeah.
And when I look into my factory, it isn't. Yes, we're lean. Okay, we've been down the lean journey. We're very lean. I've got a guy who runs a factory who is just an. In fact, our local healthcare system asked him to come in and talk to them about how to create a lean organization.
Because at Winona Health.
And at Winona Health, which you know very well because of your interview with Rochelle.
Yeah, the CEO at Winona Health.
And so this guy is so good at what he does, but it's not just a lean procedure, which is a procedure, and I understand it. Mm-hmm. It's an entire culture that you must have that embraces the concepts of, and I'll describe it this way: make the best product that can possibly be made for the least cost and the quickest amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, is that lean? Sure, it has to be, because otherwise you couldn't do it under those parameters. But the culture of lean has to be more broadly based than that. Mm-hmm. It has to be people who care about what they're doing, people who want to do what they're doing, people who believe in what they're doing, and that all comes down to culture. If companies try to implement the so-called principles of lean, well, it's been around it's been around forever.
Right.
They'll be sadly disappointed later on when they find out, okay, we're sort of making the least cost, but we still aren't maximizing what the potential is of the workforce.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with you. Thinking of it as a culture is so important. And without focusing on that culture, we've all seen situations where an organization copies tools and methods from another organization without having some of the same cultural assumptions or mindsets. Mm-hmm. And, one that we've explored on the podcast, I would love to hear your thoughts about, Steve, is, mindsets around frontline employee makes a mistake in the assembly or manufacturing of a part, or, as much as we try to prevent mistakes, mistakes happen. Nobody's perfect. And I'm just curious your thoughts on, what that culture means in regards to having an environment where everybody can learn from mistakes and hopefully not repeat them.
Well, the premise of your show is my favorite mistake.
Yeah,
I've made a lot of mistakes, and if I got fired after every mistake I ever made in this job, I probably would have been fired a dozen times. I don't know. And in my career, more than that. Mm-hmm. And the problem is some CEOs and some people think there shouldn't be any mistakes.
Yeah,
we got this lean culture. We got these quality guys walking around, and by God, we'll make sure there aren't any mistakes. That's ridiculous. Yeah. To expect no mistakes, zero defects. Yeah, I know that. Let's go to zero defects. I get all that, but that just isn't possible to happen. Mm-hmm. You can't have it happening very much.
Sure.
And if people believe that there are consequences to mistakes, now you've got a fear-based culture, and that will never be an optimized culture. It'll only be so. What they'll do is they'll cover up their mistakes.
Right.
You won't know about them until they're too late. And that's the worst thing. You have to have an open, honest dialogue on, okay, guys, That one was a mistake. No big deal. No problem. How do we fix that for the next time?
Right.
But
And that's the key. So, I've seen, this happens in healthcare too. There's an old habit of punitive responses that lead to fear and
yep,
hiding of problems. And then the small version of let's say a medication error that wouldn't have been harmful or fatal, when that's not brought to light in a way that leads to problem solving, the problem festers and the next time could kill a
right,
patient.
right,
That's a serious issue in healthcare. But I think sometimes people get stuck and they say, okay, well, we're going to be non-punitive, but they're nice. And you're in Minnesota, and there's this expression, from the upper Midwest of Minnesota nice.
yeah,
And maybe that's a different thing, but like a nice reaction that says the first part of what you said of like, well, I know you didn't mean to do it. It wasn't intentional. I hope you don't feel bad. But if they leave it at that, the problem still might be festering just the same, as opposed to the last part you added on there, Steve, which I think of as I've been taught to think of as kind. Like nice says, oh, I know you didn't mean to do it. Don't feel bad. Kind takes the next steps to say, well, how are we going to prevent it again? Because nobody wants to have a mistake that makes them feel bad, embarrasses them, or harms a customer. I
right.
love the way you put that.
But there's a difference between a mistake that was made because, well, why are mistakes made?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know better because they weren't trained or they weren't supported. Only one or two reasons. Now, the experts will say, oh, no, there's a dozen, or they either didn't know better or they didn't care.
Yeah.
That didn't know better is easy to fix.
Right.
Didn't care is easy to fix too.
Sure.
If you have people who don't care, well, like years ago, my mother asked me one time, rest her soul, she goes, are you making sure all those people are working out there? I said, Mom, if I had to make sure they're working, I have the wrong people.
Yeah, right,
right. You get into the don't care category. That's pretty easy to spot, and it's also easy to fix. You got to get, and I sound harsh here, you got to get rid of them.
Sure.
People who don't care, you can't train them to care. You can't coach them to care. Assuming you got the culture that would enable that, you can't change people like that. You can't change people like you and me. Our behaviors don't change.
Yeah.
Our personalities don't change. And I could coach you all day long about, Mark, you got to get a little different here on your podcast, and here's why, and you'll see, yeah. But that's, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting then, that situation. So if it's they didn't know better, they weren't trained, we can fix the training in different ways. If we've got people who don't care, well then how, instead of just getting rid of the people who don't care, how do we improve our hiring process?
Well, that's the word starts, right?
To filter out. Right?
And I think I mentioned when at the pre-call that nobody gets in, as an example, into my factory without the people that they would work with interviewing them.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't say that the ones they would work for,
with
the ones they would work with.
Yeah.
And so we have peer interviewing. And so the likelihood of somebody getting in that doesn't care after a peer interview is pretty slim. It does happen every now and again. When it does, it's what I say, you need to hire slow and fire fast. So you're going really slow to screen these people. If you find out you made a mistake, you get rid of them. And then the same thing with performance appraisals. They're done by their peers, not by the people that they were. In fact, I don't have supervisors in my factory. I have basically, for lack of a better word, I'll say it's peer awareness that manages the factory.
Is that what some people call self-managed or self-directed work teams?
Yep.
Or do you have a team lead who's not technically a supervisor? I
got people that order the material, right? And they're sort of like the orchestra leaders. And so what'll happen, as an example, everybody in my factory is trained to do every job, every single one of them. Wow. And so when we don't have orders over here, nobody works over there. They all work over here. And when we need people to work over here because we have orders over here, so the one guy sort of orchestrating things sort of manages the flow, but he doesn't stand over people like, okay, make sure you do this, do that, do that. Because once you say to them, we got orders for 500 of these, they know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't know necessarily what the order flow was.
Sure. Yeah. So I like that that term. Thinking of a conductor. I've played drums and percussion growing up. I've played in orchestras and band. The conductor doesn't try to play every instrument. During
No,
rehearsal, they might coach you a little bit, but there's you've never seen an orchestra the conductor think that second clarinet is doing a poor job and come over and elbow him out of the way and grab the clarinet.
right.
Hey, I'll just do it myself.
Yeah,
But
you don't see that.
sometimes in different workplaces, though, leaders kind of do that.
Well, the part of that problem is this is what they used to call the Peter principle. You and I are old enough to remember that.
Uh-huh.
You get a technician that's really good, and so you make him a supervisor, and he's a horrible supervisor.
Right.
Not all the time, but often
It happens, though. Yeah.
And this is the kind of guy who would look down at the one doing that, and he's not doing it right. He's not doing it the way I used to do it. He's not doing it the way I would do it. You're better off having somebody who's orchestrating the flow, or the conductor who doesn't know how to do any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And people ask me all the time, how do your people do what they do? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
And you know what? Doesn't bother me to say that. Well, you
Right.
must be you can't be in control of the business. Yeah, I'm not in control, but I am orchestrating, and I pick the right people, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
I'll just give you one quick example. I was in my factory on a Saturday, and I saw a bunch of our people with a U-Haul truck by the shipping dock. That's weird. We ship by common carrier.
Mhm.
And so curiosity got the best of me. I walked over there. I said, "What are you guys doing?" Well, we needed to ship out a product to a customer by a certain time, but we didn't have the components that we needed. So we called all over the country until we found the components that we needed. And then we rented a U-Haul and we went and got them.
Yeah.
And now we're going to take the same U-Haul. Now, these are factory people.
Yeah.
Or engineers, technicians. And I often say to people, who gave them the permission to do that? And the answer is nobody.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of culture everybody should want in their organization.
Yeah.
But that's my point. I don't know how to do what they do.
Sure. And I think when you select the right people, you train them, you empower them, then really that's a sustainable situation, a sustainable business. And as CEO, the fact that you don't know how to do every job, okay, fine. You're focusing on strategic questions that help the company evolve, right? Those frontline workers might not have said, hey Steve, we were sitting around talking, we should maybe diversify into electronics. So like that's the type of thing a CEO is doing, and kind of defining standards around culture, and that's if you were micromanaging everything, you wouldn't have time to do that, right?
No. And if you get the culture right, everything just takes care of itself. It's an automatic.
Yeah.
And my job as CEO is I've already created the culture. That was done years ago, right? But after that, my job is to make sure that it gets sustained.
Yeah.
It gets supported. And I'm always watchful of that. And then to your point, I'm supposed to look at the long range issues. I'm supposed to make the kind of big decisions. And I'm supposed to lead the board.
Yeah.
And that is the job. I'm not the chairman of the board, but it is my job. And by default, I've been doing it 25 years. I lead the board to places they need to go, they should go, but they wouldn't necessarily know they need to go there because they're not involved in the day-to-day issues.
Mm-hmm. Right. Nor should they be.
Exactly.
Right. Well, Steve, with all of your experiences as CEO and otherwise, I want to step back and ask you one other question about, I think this is in the category of things that you talk about more broadly. Leadership attitudes that lead to disaster in a company. I'm guessing one of them might be creating a fear-based environment. Or what are some other leadership attitudes that are more likely than not leading to disaster?
Well, another one is arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
When you think you're the smartest guy in the room, I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I know that. And nor do I want to be. God help the organization if I am the smartest guy in the room. Yeah. Arrogance leads to disaster because you think you know everything and you're not paying attention. The third one is I get a disaster, Mark, about once a year.
Mm-hmm.
I do. Last year, it happened to be my chief financial officer, without warning or without notice, walked away one day. Just walked away. Nobody knew how he did what he did. No. And so I could go every year. I know I'm going to have a disaster. And the leadership attitude that can lead to disaster is not believing you're ever going to have a disaster.
Yeah.
Never going to have a disaster, right? Everything's good. You know, I could stay out on the golf course, no problem. The business on overdrive. As an example, I look at the order intake every single day. Now, I don't micromanage the order intake, but if there's anything funny or goofy about that, I'll know it way. And I look at it. Here's today this year. Here's today last year. Here's today the year before, and so forth. And so I can spot trends from a mile away. And when you're not monitoring, CEO's job is to monitor the performance of the company. If you're ignoring that or you're not paying attention to that will surely lead to disaster.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, if you think you're never going to get a disaster, that's how you're going to get the next disaster, because it's oh my God, there's a disaster. And every company has them. And most times you can't predict them. If you ask me what's your next disaster going to be, I don't know. But I know it when I see it, and I know what to do right away when I do see it, and I'm very quick to react to major problems.
Yeah.
I don't sit around. I don't noodle on it. I don't get focus groups together on it. I sort of act like now.
Yeah. And so it sounds like a different leadership attitude. That leads to disaster is not being able to differentiate, between the time to empower and let others make a decision versus the time when you do need to jump in.
That's right. That's a good point, Mark, because there are times when I have to move decisively and I have to move quickly. And during the pandemic, that was one of those times. And people expect you to be that way in a crisis.
Yeah.
They don't want you to go, oh my God, if you're running around with your hair on fire, that'll just cause havoc in the organization. Yeah. People in a crisis want to be assured that the people in charge really do know how to navigate their way out of this.
And as part of that, part of that is making the right decision. As part of that, if you will, optics of your body language and what people are seeing from you as a leader, kind of trying to at least give the impression of I don't know. Like, I guess if everyone knew it was a disaster and the leader seems too calm, that could be upsetting in a different way. So maybe it's a matter of kind of finding the right.
Well, it's a matter of taking action.
Yeah.
Take action. If you're too calm and you're sort of sitting around, let's see what happens. That is the optics are important, but you need to take action. You don't want people to think he doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know what to do, Mr. Leader, pretend like you know what to do and do it. Now, don't go firing off every gun you can think of and doing every stupid thing you can think of. Pick your bets and place your money and get on with it. Then because in a situation like that, you don't want people running for the hills. You don't want people hunkering down and getting much less productive because they're afraid and they don't know what you're going to do. You want to make sure you sort of keep the ship afloat.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've kept the ship afloat a long time. Others have helped keep the ship afloat at Miller Ingenuity. So I certainly wish you and everybody there the best for the rest of this year and beyond.
We appreciate that. And the same to you and your podcast.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Again, we've been joined by Steve Blue, Stephen L. Blue. You can learn more about him at his website, stephenlblue.com. I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes. This has been, thank you for your insights, Steve. This has been a really interesting conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Great.